I've always had this weird fascination with stinky chemicals. I mean, you've got your cadaverian, which, yeah, smells like rotting bodies, and there's butyric acid, that's basically the smell of vomit, but they're all just opening acts. They're nothing compared to the main event, the undisputed heavyweight champion of foul odors, a chemical called thioacetone.
So it really all boils down to this one question, right? What is the world's stinkiest chemical? And if you dig into the science, all signs, all legends point to thioacetone. This stuff is so infamous, so notorious for its just unbelievably foul odor, that it's actually classified as a dangerous chemical. The stories about it, they're the stuff of legend. Okay, so let's get into it. The legend really kicks off way back in 1889 in a German city called Freiburg. A couple of scientists accidentally let a tiny amount of this stuff escape. That little bit of smell spread across a huge part of the town, and the result? People were literally fainting and vomiting in the streets. It caused a full-blown panic evacuation. That one event over 100 years ago is what cemented its terrifying reputation. Now, when you hear these wild stories like being able to smell a single drop from half a kilometer away, you gotta be a little skeptical, right? It just sounds impossible. And here's the kicker. You can't buy thioacetone. Not anywhere. And apparently nobody's even tried to make it in over 60 years. So there was really only one way to find out if the legends are true. You had to make it from scratch. And this is where our quest really begins. Because before you can create a monster, well, you've got to find the recipe. So the hunt for the recipe was like some real-life detective work. There are no modern instructions. Nothing. But a little clue on Wikipedia pointed back to the original scientists. Yep, the same guys who caused the disaster in 1889. A quick Google search of their names and the year, and boom, there it was, the original scientific paper. The only problem? The whole thing was in 130-year-old German. Thank goodness for Google Translate, right?
So with that translated document in hand, the original 1889 recipe revealed its secrets. It was a 3-stage plan to unleash this olfactory horror.
The plan they laid out was actually, surprisingly simple. First, you start with something you can get anywhere, basic acetone. Then you use that to create a more stable, oily compound called trithioacetone. You can think of this stuff as the beast in a cage. And then, the final, terrifying step, you heat up that trithioacetone until it cracks apart, releasing the unstable monster itself, thioacetone.
But here's where it gets serious. There was a huge catch that just screamed danger. To make that first step happen, you have to bubble hydrogen sulfide gas through the acetone. And let me be clear, hydrogen sulfide is not a joke. It is an incredibly dangerous chemical. In fact, it's nearly as toxic as cyanide gas. So this whole thing suddenly wasn't just about a bad smell, it was a genuinely hazardous, life-threatening process.
So, with the recipe found and the dangers very clearly understood, it was time for the synthesis itself. And this wasn't going to be some quick reaction. This was a long, tense, 12-hour ordeal.
Yeah, you heard that right. The original paper from 1889 said you have to bubble that toxic gas through the acetone for 10 to 12 hours, continuously, with no breaks. You can't just set it and walk away. You have to watch it constantly. It made for an incredibly long and paranoid day in the lab.
And then you get the first moment of absolute panic. The creator's brother just walks in and casually says, "Yo, it kind of smells bad outside." And just like that, the fear is real. Did some of it escape? Is the fume hood failing? Is the legend already starting to come true? It turned out to be a false alarm, just a nearby sewage smell. But man, the tension in that room was real.
But the next day, the real warning sign appeared. The entire room just reeked of sulfur. And the source? It wasn't a leak. It was a single, almost invisibly small speck of the precursor chemical, the trithioacetone, that had gotten on a glove and been tossed in the trash. Think about that. If a tiny speck of the tame version could do that, what in the world was the final product going to be capable of?
That realization made one thing crystal clear. The final test absolutely could not happen in the lab. It couldn't happen anywhere near other people. No, it was time to find a much more isolated location.
And this just shows you the insane level of precaution they had to take. I mean, to avoid causing a modern-day repeat of that 1889 disaster in Freiburg, the final stage of the experiment was moved to a rented private island, far away from any unsuspecting noses. This was going to be the stage for the final reveal.
So, after all that buildup, they heat up the trithioacetone and finally unleash the thioacetone, and the creator takes a whiff and is actually disappointed. He said it smelled pretty much the same as the precursor, but his friend who was filming? Oh, that was a completely different story. It was just sheer, unfiltered disgust, a 10 out of 10 on the reek scale, the nastiest thing he'd ever smelled. How could two people have such a wildly different experience?
And this is where it gets truly bizarre. As the friends started moving away from the flask, the smell didn't get weaker, he said it seemed to get stronger. This sparked some genuine concern. He's looking across the water at houses just a few hundred meters downwind, worried this thing is going to travel across the lake. The fear wasn't about the smell anymore, it was about its terrifying ability to spread.
So after that whole adventure, what's the final verdict? Is thiocetone for real? Is it truly the stinkiest chemical known to humanity?
The answer is yes. Oh yes, the legend is absolutely true. But here's the twist. The real horror. The thing that makes it so terrifying isn't just the scent itself, which is, a lovely mix of garbage, sewage, and a gas leak. It's the bizarre and frightening properties of that smell.
Okay, let's break it down. First, its potency is just unbelievable. A tiny, tiny drop goes a very long way. Second, and this is the weirdest part, it seems to get worse as it gets less concentrated and spreads out. Third, its ability to travel is just insane. It can easily cover hundreds of meters. And finally, and maybe this is the most terrifying thing of all, it's a disorienting 360-degree smell. You can't tell where it's coming from. And that is exactly what would cause the kind of mass panic they saw back in 1889.
In the end, this whole quest kind of reveals a bigger picture. We've basically conquered the Mount Everest of stench. But it really makes you wonder, what other sensory extremes are still out there, waiting to be found? What's the quietest possible sound, the brightest light, or the bitterest taste? This whole adventure reminds us that there are still so many frontiers of human perception left to explore.